Hi, I'm Jen Gaster from HR Heads, and today I am super excited to welcome Jennie Mead, Chief People Officer from Aptitude Software. Jennie, thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, I'm really pleased to be here and to be sharing some of the experiences that I've had with those following you at HR Heads.
Oh, you're so kind to spend the time. Jennie, I'm going to jump straight in. Chief People Officer at Aptitude. Tell me, what was your journey like to get into that role?
Oh, to get into the role, it was quite interesting actually, because I was working previously at a company called Cloud Factory, which is in the AI space in technology. And I was actually approached to join the role. And at a time when actually I was thinking a bit more about what my next move was going to be. And so for me, with any organisation that I join, first and foremost, I will look at the culture of the organisation. Is it aligned? Can I work with, obviously, the senior leadership team and for me, the CEO as well? Am I aligned with the industry, of course, and everything else? And there's a few other bits and pieces, but fundamentally, does it align with my flexible working and what I need to do as a mum, as a wife, as a daughter, etc., etc. So that was quite critical for me in terms of just in terms of what I was looking for and how I got to Aptitude. But super excited to be at Aptitude, and we've done a lot in the last year. I tend to focus on scale up when the organisation's in scale up mode. And so there's lots of transition and transformation happening at the moment, which it's great to be part of.
And keeps you very busy.
Very busy.
And you alluded you've worked in the software sector previously. What is it that draws you specifically to that sector?
I really like the fast pace. So I actually started my career back in the day when I came out of university in the software industry, and I got a great exposure because I went into a graduate program for quite a large software company of actually, before going into HR, of actually doing client support, implementation, training on the software. So started to see the end-to-end life cycle of a software house effectively. Came out of that industry. I was in the industry for about 5 years, came out of the industry, then went back into it again and really love it now. What I love about it is the fast pace. You can't stay still at all.
Yeah.
And I really like to see what we call the Horizon 2, Horizon 3 planning, which sometimes absolutely blows my mind when I'm hearing about the technology that we're going to all experience. When I worked back at Convergys back in the early 2000s, it was at that point they were starting to develop software, because it was a billing solution software company, to capture how you were going to pay for things using your phone. I could not believe at that point in the early 2000s we were thinking about, the idea of going to be able to buy a can of Coke using your phone. I mean, now
I don't carry a card ever now. I only use my phone. It's crazy.
But that's crazy. But we were talking about that as a company back in 2002.
Yeah.
And that's what's really exciting about it. So I love it.
Yeah. And you've worked previously in different sectors. So you were an HR consultant with the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. You probably couldn't get much different, but what was that experience like, and what did you take from that perhaps you still hold on to today?
So the Australian Broadcasting Corporation I did when I was actually working in Australia. And so aside from the fact that it was quite cool in my 20s to be working for a media, television and radio organisation in a country that I actually didn't know who the talent was, because it wasn't like the BBC. It was, individuals that now I know who they are, but I would stand next to people in the lift and not even know how famous they were in Australia. But I would say the biggest experience that I took from that is employment legislation and the way in which you operate as a HR professional in Australia certainly was very, very different to how we were operating. So when I was working there in 2003-ish, the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development had only just become chartered within the last couple of years. They'd never had anything like that over in Australia. So for me, going over as a chartered I think I was a management, an MCIPD at that time. I went over and everyone was like, what's that? How can you be chartered in your profession as a HR person? Because they didn't have anything like that at the time. And actually, the environment in which I worked in was very much akin to what I'd been learning about on my degree, that was an environment in the 1980s, 1970s, in the UK. Very highly trade unionised, but very different in the way in which the employment legislations and everything else. And you've got to remember that for us in the UK, and certainly in the early parts of 2000, we went through quite a lot of legislation changes that they just didn't have in Australia. The only thing that they were really advanced on, I would say, is health and safety in Australia. Okay. But everything else was still, they were still learning about. And so it was quite nice for me, because I was able to go over and put my learning and my experience, both from an academic perspective, but also the first years of my career. And they were all wowed at it. Now, I think it'd be a very different place. But I really enjoyed it. And the fact that you get to live in Sydney was brilliant. So, yeah.
And you referenced there your academics. You've done a number of certifications, and you were lucky enough to study at Stanford University. How important is CPD to you as an individual, but also within, your team and driving that through the HR space?
It is so important. If you don't do CPD, you're never going to keep up. And I think as a phrase that I use is, you never graduate from the school of self-learning. And I think that any leader, no matter what level they are at in the organisation, they have to continue to learn all the time, because we're in an ever-changing environment as it is. So whether it's technical learning, that's one aspect of it, but also learning how to actually lead and engage others, particularly in a changing world. So if you take coming out of the COVID pandemic, people are like, oh, how do we get hybrid working or remote working to work? Well, you need to learn to be able to do that. And I think that sometimes organisations that just do massive U-turns on these sorts of things, rather than asking the question, how are we going to do it? We must get this right. Because I personally think that 10 years from now, certainly 20 years from now, when my son goes into the world of work, it's going to be a very different world of work. Yeah. So that has to be a learning. And I think there's a lot of work that I've certainly done with the leadership team here at Aptitude around leading in a digital world is very different to leading in an office-based world. And you just keep having to try and continue to learn to do that, really. So I think we have to be intentional about it.
Yeah, and I'm certainly seeing there's a real void that's come about around leadership and management capability. When you're not present and you're not seeing it in the moment, and then somebody is scheduled to be on screen with you and they put, what I call their game face on. I'm fine, but actually they're not fine. But, they can hold it together and be fine for that hour's meeting and then go away. I think the human resources function has a long way to go in really improving what is on offer from a management and leadership capability perspective. I don't mean L&D purely for HR, I mean for all of the line managers that exist in the business, and really getting them to be tip top at their role.
They do. And I again buy into the philosophy that everyone is a leader. So we have this idea that you are a leader of self, no matter what career level you are. And you have to be given the skills to be able to do that, right the way up to the leader of business. And we've developed different leadership programs that we're trying to pull the content together now, so that we can deal with that. So that actually, when you've got a graduate that comes in who may be operating in a remote or a hybrid way, they have a certain skill set. And you're right, with the HR professionals, we need a different skill set to be able to deliver that. We need to be able to manage communities of people in the digital world, and that requires a different skill set to actually the employee relations that we learned all about years and years ago.
As a technical piece, it's the emotional intelligence, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's the bit that's actually, we've just come out of Mental Wellbeing Month, many of us have, and that's the piece that actually, it's to your point, you turn your screen off, but how do you know how that person's really feeling? The only way you can do that is because you've developed trust and and an openness. And how do organisations think about that and foster that? Because they may be saving money on, not having as many office spaces and downsizing. But they shouldn't just take that as a complete saving. They should be investing that to make sure that the right systems are in place to be able to lead, the right leadership trainings available, and the connection points are as well.
The well-being piece.
Yeah,
absolutely. So I think that's a massive opportunity for HR. What else is on your agenda for the function? Do you see, as an industry agnostic, but an HR specialism sort of driving over the next few years?
Really interesting. So I did a recent networking event, and one of the conversations that sparked was, how do you think about skill sets in a remote world? So this whole idea around, we're going to need to, certainly in the technical space, you can't just rely on where you've got company entities. And so I think that whole approach of talent acquisition, but where you go and get talent and how you engage that talent, both in terms of contractually engage them, without having to spend a huge amount of money on setting up company entities. So like the Global Employment Organization is one that I think HR professionals are going to have to get their head around in terms of managing very, smaller numbers of people in multiple locations. Little pockets.
And the complexity of it and all the different legislation that goes with it is, it's not insignificant, is it?
Okay. And the community piece as well. So, but the technical aspect of it, absolutely. How do we do that effectively? So, location strategy, how you go and get the talent 2 to 5 years from now. How are we making sure, particularly in the technical industry, but I think any industry. So I think that has to be front and foremost. And I do think that, if I think back to 2022 and what was on the list of around retention and engagement, regardless of the fact that what we're seeing in the macroeconomic environment at the moment, this is still a challenge. It's the most bizarre, dare I say the word, recession at the moment, because you've got, it's not like 2008. So if I take the UK as an example, where we went into a recession, we saw hiring freezes, we also saw pay freezes, bonuses not being paid. That's not happening at the moment, because actually,
on the contrary, I'm dealing with wage inflation, and in the talent space, that's a huge challenge.
Yeah, the war on talent is still there. So that's the balance, I think, and it's a round table discussion that I think is very alive at the moment as to how we engage a community that's actually, or the employees that's actually looking for some very different things themselves. I think
generationally led as much as anything. That diversity piece.
So I think those are still topic of mind. And how do you, as I said earlier on, how do we lead in a digital world? How do we connect people with purpose in an organisation and communicate with them as well?
Sense of belonging and embed the culture and all of that. And what specifically do you look for when you hire into your team? What makes a candidate have the X factor for you?
So I think first and foremost that cultural alignment has to fit, because that's a really big part for me, both in terms of, I get that sometimes it's nice to have, some companies need a disruptor in amongst it, but I do think that cultural alignment, can I work with and trust that person to be able to get on and do? I very much take the approach of empowering others. So that, again, looking at somebody who actually takes initiative, will put forward ideas that will be transparent and open and honest with me as much as I am with them. So I like the challenge up, as well as I provide challenge and support too. And I think that for me as well, with somebody coming in, is somebody who is very, to your question about CPD, I need to, I can't.
The growth mindset almost.
Exactly.
Self-starting growth mindset.
That growth mindset, and always wanting to keep their finger on the pulse, because actually people who really want to do the CPD, who are knowing what's going on out, come with ideas, that's what's fresh. Because I'm one of these individuals that like to have a team that actually debates, brings forward lots of ideas, and not just, we learn from each other.
Yeah.
And I think
Shared
it's
experience.
shared experiences. Yeah. So that and somebody who's willing to, get on and do what we need to do in HR, and in a way that's human and kind. I think some of the things that we're having to do at the moment as professions, I mean, it's not without challenge, is it, in this economic environment? I think you can always do it with human touch and kindness and empathy when doing our roles. So, yeah.
I've got a son at the moment, he's 16 doing GCSEs, and I keep saying to him, these results don't define you. He's a good student and he'll be fine. But actually, the kind of man you grow into, human qualities, kindness, empathy, emotional intelligence, that's what defines you. And I think it's certainly the generations coming into the workplace, we can't lose sight of that. We have to really drill that home first and foremost.
Yeah. And I think what's important, as I said earlier on, what's important for me is that flexibility. And I just think that's the way forward, because particularly if you're working I tend to work in global organisations. When you're working in a global organisation, you need to be flexible.
Yeah.
But I think it's really important to get that balance. And I don't want somebody who's going to be coming in and then burning out because they can't get that balance. Equally, we have to work together to be able to do that. So, and that's important for me anyway.
And Jennie, you've been so kind with your time. So my last question is, what advice would you give an aspiring CPO? They're in HR, the career is established, but they aspire to be that number one role. What advice would you give them?
So I think, the technical aspects of being in HR is really key. And I've always given advice on the technical side of it to try and get as much breadth as possible, because you can get as much experience as possible in using what I call the academic stuff, then that's great. My always advice on that is don't always take it as textbook, because if I just take agile project management, for example, the way you apply it into a HR part of an organization is very different to how you might apply it elsewhere. Whether it's HR or in different organizations, it's got to be applied in the way that it fits. From a leadership perspective, I fundamentally believe that it's really, really important to invest in getting certain leadership skills in. Don't mean management skills, I mean leadership skills in how you hold yourself. And I think this whole idea of that leader of self right the way up, and look at how somebody is going to be intentional about doing that. One thing that I've really found that's useful for me, certainly right the way back in my career, is I always set key milestones. And by the time I'm X years old, I always did it by my age, unfortunately, but by the time I was X, I wanted to be doing this. By the time I was this age, I wanted to be doing that. I still do it now. By the time I'm 50, I want to be doing this. I think you have to be really intentional about what you want to do and then work your way back. Don't just let it happen by accident. Don't be accidental in the way that you become a CPO. Really think about actually what is it that you want to achieve? When do you want to achieve it by? How are you going to work back? And always get somebody who's going to hold you to account with that, whether it be a mentor, a professional mentor, or a friend mentor, or something like that, that's actually going to keep you accountable to what you set out to do. And that's my biggest piece of advice.
Because I always work with where do you want to get to? Where are you today? How many stepping stones are there? And actually, what's the gap? Identify the gap analysis for yourself and then do something about it. It's that piece, isn't it?
And it's not, and to be a CPO, it's not the technical side of it. Yes, the technical experience is really helpful and getting that experience is great. But to be a CPO, you need to lead in an organisation. And you have, certainly from my experience, I have a team of people that really support me in doing that. But I have to be responsible of working with the CEO to make sure we have the leadership capability right the way across the organisation. So I have to make sure that I understand, what it is that product do, what it is that the global technology team do, what it is that market, etc. And I quite like that. It's that breadth. It is that breadth. And so how you lead yourself and how you get people to follow you is so important. And also being able to craft that vision and that future through storytelling and all of that good stuff as well is key. So don't just always focus on the technical aspect. That's important, but focus on how you're going to build the other bits up as well.
Jennie Mead, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us today.
Oh, you're welcome, Jen.